Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm Angela, and I'm encouraging you, if you're loving these videos, to not forget to subscribe and to like and to let me know what you think of the episodes. So, I'm just super excited again to have another guest with me. This one's really special, a unique perspective on grief and some mental health. And he's got a wealth of knowledge to share with us. So I'm going to introduce him. Um, he is someone who's redefining how we understand mental health and spiritual transformation. Sean Blackwell is the author of Bipolar Awakenings, The Quest to Heal Bipolar Disorder, a groundbreaking exploration of the connection between bipolar disorder and spiritual emergence. Death and unresolved grief can often be a traumatizing or a triggering factor for someone going into depression or a manic state. For over a decade, Sean has been sharing his journey and helping others navigate the intersection of psychology and awakening through his YouTube channel and international retreats. I am looking forward to exploring the territory between our mutual interest in spirituality and also grief and healing. So, thank you and welcome to the podcast, Sean.
Thank you, Angela. It's very nice to be here on such an original podcast. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. So, the idea of bipolar disorder, I've heard that it's incurable, it can be a lifelong illness. What is your perspective? And can you explain a little bit more about it? Because I'm not sure everybody really understands that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and it's largely misunderstood. And part of the reason is that in the psychiatric manual, the diagnostic manual, we have a group of labels, all kinds of different labels, but that those labels don't necessarily have a specific biological connection. There's no scientific evidence of anything in the diagnostic statistical manual existing. What they have is a set of symptoms. And if you fit into certain symptoms, they'll give you one label, like a certain set of symptoms, you got schizophrenia, certain set of symptoms, you get depression, other ones, bipolar, etc. What people normally think of as bipolar disorder used to be referred to a lot as manic depression, which is the symptoms of nonstop talking, having a lot of business plans, perhaps being a little bit argumentative, hypersexual, going on shopping sprees, spending a lot of money. That would be what you would describe as hypomania. You're annoying, but you're still functioning. All right. Now, when people have that sort of mania, it gets diagnosed as bipolar 2, and then it swings into the depression, which I think people are more familiar with. That's bipolar 2. But bipolar 1 is where that hypomania goes into psychosis. Psychosis, you have a break with reality, and it's pretty much you're functioning from a dream world space, okay? And there you can have delusions that tend to be flipped into one of two categories, rooted in love or fear, and the fearful ones become paranoia, and the loving ones are kind of, well, yeah, it's spiritual, for lack of a better word. And so that's the bipolar 1 diagnosis. The delusional one, they refer to as acute psychosis, but that term, acute psychosis, also has roots that go into schizophrenia. So, for example, in the 1980s, if you had an acute psychosis, you would have been diagnosed in most psychiatric hospitals in the United States and Canada with schizophrenia. That same person now would be diagnosed with bipolar 1. So they've changed the nomenclature around this whole thing. It's been a bit of a shell game. And you'll hear psychiatrists say sometimes, we've got schizophrenia under control. And that's right, you do. But the bipolar disorder numbers over here are exploding. And that's because all the people you used to diagnose as schizophrenic are now being diagnosed as bipolar. And those numbers are through the roof. So that's what's going on there.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Sometimes it comes down to the definition, doesn't it? Like it's,
Yeah.
yeah. And I've found
Yeah.
that with grief as well. It comes right down to the definition.
How you're framing things is
Yes,
very important. And how you frame it can also dictate your outcome.
exactly.
Mhm.
Absolutely. So what what is the cause of this? Bipolar disorder something that you're born with, or is it something that happens? What is it about?
Okay, well, to start, like I mentioned, it's a category. It's given this
Mhm.
label based on the symptoms. When they give you the medical exams, they come up empty. And this story that we've been told about disorders being caused by too much or too little dopamine or serotonin or a genetic factor, nothing has been identified there. And in fact, when it comes to the dopamine and serotonin, people with disorders have the same range of serotonin and dopamine as a typical normal person. And that's what the research dictates. But from the work of Stan Grof, and that's where I got my start with transpersonal psychiatrist and psychologist, Dr. Stanislav Grof, that most disorders, as far as I'm concerned, are rooted in trauma. Now, what's trauma? And it's funny because usually we start with my origin story, but I think for your audience, it's better to start right where we are,
Okay.
because, and people are like, well, this guy's not a doctor, so where is he getting all this information? But I think let's just get that part and then we'll get back to how I got started. Trauma isn't necessarily something bad that happens to you. It's a part of an experience that is just too overwhelming for your psyche to feel, right?
Mhm.
And so when the event happens, you just emotionally check out. And the checked out part, and it may be partial, it might be complete, the checked out part goes into what appears to be our bioenergetic system that's somehow connected to our central nervous system. You might call it a chakra system. And the energy that's being blocked, or the trauma blockages, is blocking our life force, which in the East we call Kundalini. So you're supposed to have this natural flow of Kundalini, and we all have trauma blockages. But when those blockages become overwhelming, too much, then we can have these difficult experiences. Most people, almost everybody I've worked with who has bipolar disorder, they tell me, actually, I had depression for a lot of years when I was a teenager.
Mhm.
That's usually where it starts. So you've got this milder blockage, which is leading to a general depression. But then if it goes unresolved, the blockages get stronger, and then you go into bipolar acute psychosis. And then if it continues to be unresolved, the 20 years down the line, that person with the diagnosis of bipolar, that can shift into a more of a schizophrenic or schizoaffective diagnosis where the material becomes more pervasive regardless of the medications and more paranoid, you know.
Mhm.
So it can get darker if nothing's done about it. So, trauma for me is this part of our psyche that just can't deal with things. Is That's the trauma. And I would say the most simple example, and this goes back to your topic, is if you see somebody at a funeral and they're watching their loved one being buried and they're not crying, and afterwards they're saying, why have I never cried over his death or her death? It's like I didn't feel anything. It's because they're traumatized. That the emotional psyche, it was just too overwhelming for them, and then the psyche takes it away. You know.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah. And that makes perfect sense to me. Through the experience that I went through losing my husband. I mean, the first months, and I think a lot of widows would agree that you're almost numb. You can't feel all that you, it's, I think you would just explode. Like it's too much.
Mhm.
Right. And so, yeah, it's like trauma.
Mhm. And
Then as time goes on, it just seemed like I was more able to, with coaching, I was able to start to feel into some of those emotions and start to express them and learn how to allow them to happen, because it was like I spent a whole life pushing them down. So I was very good at it.
mm,
Yeah. And
mhm.
so, grief taught me a lot about the way that I approach emotions that come to me, and the value of being able to feel into emotion and how healing that is, and how they don't have to um, be volcanic. Because I found that in the beginning, those emotions, if I started to let them up, it was just like I had no control. Like once it started, I didn't know when it would ever stop. And now I realize it was because I had been holding it for so long.
Right, right.
Yeah, yeah,
And the one thing that your story reminds me of is, and people often don't think about this, I don't think, is you think of trauma as this horribly painful experience and you're kind of, you don't want to go there, right? It's like psyche blocks you. But when my father died, in 1 second, my mother had lost her partner of over 40 years, the only man she's ever been with. And all of a sudden, she's got all these documents in front of her that she's got to sign. She's got to contact the funeral home. She's got to be talking to the doctors. She's got to be informing the family. And just this flood of tasks comes up in front of you as the widow
yes.
that leaves no space for grieving in that moment at all, you know. And so it took her some time to get over the hump because of that. And I noticed it, like after about 4 months, I'd gone back to see her because I live in Brazil, and I saw her about 4 months after the death. And I noticed that she was stuck, you know, and it was like, okay, something's got to give here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that often happens. I'm on social media. I'm in a lot of
Mhm.
widows groups, and I wouldn't say I'm hugely active there, but I'm monitoring. And I see a lot of women who are stuck for many, many years, still in that, what I want to say is a trauma loop. Like you keep remembering the trauma and you remember, and then the emotions come up, and then you just continually trigger those things, and it continues, right? And so my my heart goes out to those women and men that are in that situation where they just can't seem to break out of that cycle or that loop. Um, what would you have? What advice would you have for those people?
Breath work.
Yeah,
That would be the first. I'm dying to talk about it. Yeah, and maybe we'll get to my origin story at one point. But
for sure.
the work I do with people with bipolar disorder and they're traumatized is I have well, the work at least started in 2013 as a private healing retreat where I've just worked with one client and their supporter. So the client's got bipolar disorder. And we do an offshoot of what Dr. Stan Grof called holotropic breath work. And I'm a certified holotropic breathwork facilitator. Okay. Now, there's a wide variety of breathwork techniques out there. And I think that if you're grieving, some of them could be helpful and some of them could be very unhelpful.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because, for example, Wim Hof breathing is you're using an accelerated, very aggressive form of breathing, but it has the intention of reducing inflammation and helping you survive in cold climates and swim in cold water. That's what it's about, right?
Okay.
Um, so, so it doesn't have an emotional focus.
Mm-hmm.
Other breathwork techniques are about activating your kundalini to become a more spiritually enlightened person, for example. Other ones are just about relaxation, generally deep, long, focused breathing into the belly, almost in a meditation style. So that's one way to go. But holotropic breathwork was designed to help people release trauma. And the idea there and it came out of Stan Grof's work in psychedelic therapy. He was the last psychiatrist in the United States legally allowed to do psychedelic therapy in the early 70s before Nixon just shut it all down. And when he did shut it down, Grof had recognized that when he saw people in non-ordinary states, sometimes they spontaneously started to breathe harder and then they seemed to get better. So he said, well, what if we, look at the roots of these things in India and places like that and see what happens if we do breath work, and well, let's add music to it and give it a safe container. And he started doing these 3-hour groups, started out as 90 minutes, then extended to 3 hours. And with music that starts out pretty aggressively, like primal drumming, and then shifts into more emotional after an hour, and then after another hour, more relaxing. And in this sort of musical flow, you start out with a simple relaxation exercise and you're laying on a yoga mat. And then you start to breathe aggressively. But this is interesting in your own style. So it's not like, oh, 6 breaths in, hold, 6 breaths out, or in through the nose or out through the mouth. You follow your intuition and breathe how you want. And what this does is it opens up the ego. And if you think of a surfer, the surfer needs to swim out to meet the waves. And then once he's got a wave, he can stand up and he stops swimming. Yeah, sorry, he needs to swim out to meet the waves, not surf out to meet the waves. Once he gets up and he starts surfing, he doesn't need to be swimming anymore, right? And so with the breathing, we're kind of breathing our way out to the waves of the unconscious. And then once we're there, once we feel that wave of unconscious material come up, then we're free to express ourselves however we want, as long as we stay on the mat and we don't hurt ourselves, you know. So that means a lot of physical movement, anxiety, you can be shaking your hands or stretching, you know, this kind of thing. And a lot of vocalization, sometimes talking, you know. And so, for example, in my own process, part of my grieving for my father and his passing, his image came up to me while I was in a holotropic breathwork process with another trained facilitator. And he had died, my dad had died, and we just had this long conversation, you know, where I was telling him, I was like, well, I guess you finally understand what I do now, huh? Because during his lifetime, he had no orientation. And he was the kind of guy, he converted to Catholicism just in case. he didn't want to get to heaven and find out he wasn't part of the club, you know. So he doubled down on my mother's religion and thought, well, this is probably going to get me in the door, you know. He wasn't a particularly enlightened individual, although he was a very nice guy. Yeah. And so having a conversation with him helped me process my grief and move through as well. All right.
Very cool.
So that's how I see breath work helping. And in my work with clients, there have been situations where the breath work has helped people come to peace with people who've passed away in other situations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I can attest to that because I did do a session. It was a 90-minute session, one-on-one with a facilitator. And like you say, all the music and the breathing. And it it was early on in my grief, probably 3-4 months in.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember coming out of that being really vulnerable emotionally. Um, and yet at the same time, it brought to surface so many things that had been just hidden, and I remember thinking the biggest thing that came to me was I had lost my best friend. I had lost my best
Mm.
friend, and that was like the worst thing ever. And that moment that could ever happen is I had lost my best friend. And fortunate for me, I was working through that. And at the same time, I had another shaman that was working with me. And it just, one thing built on another, and the healing took place. But that, I believe, was a huge part of that, just bringing those emotions and those realizations to the surface where I could see them.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in one client situation in particular, um, the client had struggled, her father had been abusive with her and he had passed away. But part of letting go of that whole thing, um, and there, the grief and the trauma are just intertwined. It's
Mm-hmm.
just all mixed in, and it comes in layers. But there was one moment where I was holding her on the yoga mat, and she had her head into my chest, and she's just talking away, talking away, talking away, and having this conversation while in a non-ordinary state herself. She wasn't in a grounded state, but talking to me as if I were her father. And then that let go of the whole process.
Right.
And just for anybody who's curious to know, in holotropic breath work, there is physical contact when it's requested by the client, okay, or to protect them if they start to hurt themselves. And when a man is working with a woman, there should always be another woman in the room to protect them both, because misunderstandings can happen both ways. And of course, improper contact has the potential to happen. So you've got a female supporter in the room all the time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So tell me a little bit more about your story. How did you get to doing all of this work?
Yeah. Yeah, we're working backwards. Um, it's a bit of a long story. I'll kind of keep it a little shorter for you. But in 1996, I had an experience in a self-help seminar, the Landmark Forum, that threw me into a non-ordinary state. It started with a meditation on our fears, and then into it, what surfaced was, for the first time in my life, trauma related to a scuba diving accident I had had just a couple of months ago, or months previous to the event. I had lost my weight belt 30 meters below the surface. Okay. Yeah. And I could have died. And I was actually looking at this depth gauge in the meditation, taking me back to that moment when I was wondering if I would die before I hit the surface, because you can get a brain embolism and that's it. It's a sudden death. And when that came up, all the fear of that moment came up. I burst into tears. My body was shaking. And and there was a punch at the heart. It was like the heart chakra opened up. And I'm just totally open and vulnerable. And all my senses sharpened. I could see detail in curtains I couldn't see before. It was like, wow, look at this kind of thing. And I had a sense of all knowingness. Like I felt like I didn't know enough before. And then all of a sudden I knew things. And after being in this sort of really kind of out there with a sense of oneness and opening up about family issues, and all this continued for about 5 days, I eventually thought that this only happens to somebody who's died. And I thought I died during the scuba diving accident.
Mm.
So, so in a sense, I'm the one dying in this case. And then I was I went into an adjacent ballroom from the intensive self-help course and took off all my clothes, and I was going to meet God, you know. And then when they found me, I refused to get dressed. And so the police grabbed me, put me in a stretcher, and took me to the psychiatric hospital. And I still thought the hospital was some sort of spaceship taking me to heaven or nirvana of some kind, you know.
Wow.
Yeah. But then the delusion started to break, I think. And the first moment was when I got a forced injection, because because up until then, I thought I was being tested by God. That's why I was taking my clothes off to be in a pure state to go meet God. And then, I had 6 security guards with their hands on me, and I'm in my underwear. And then the doctor said he wasn't going to inject me if I calmed down, and I calmed down. And then he still injected me. Like he
Ah.
just lied to me. And I thought, well, that's not going to be part of the test. God's not going to do something like that to me. And when I finally woke up a few days later, I told them that I thought I had a PTSD reaction to what happened. But it was very good for me. It was like a spiritual experience. Um, and it took a while, but I eventually went back to work, and my life got a lot better, and my salary tripled over the next 3 years. And I felt more connected to my work and just more in the flow of life. Something had really opened up. And so I had read a book by Groff, where he coined an experience like that, a spiritual emergency, where you're having a spiritual experience, like an opening of the heart chakra, that gets so powerful that you have difficulty integrating, and it starts to look like schizophrenia,
Mm.
but it's not. And so I was like, okay, well, that's schizophrenia is over there. I'm over here. These are two completely different things. Fast forward 10 years. I'm in Brazil. I'm working as an English teacher. I'm no longer in advertising. I live with my Brazilian wife, and she has a younger niece named Anna who has an experience. And I was like, well, this sounds like what happened to me. And then we met her, looked like what happened to me. But then the psychiatrists were calling it bipolar and medicating her. And then I started this interaction like, well, what's the difference between what happened to her and what happened to me? And what I learned from people online, I made a YouTube channel, and I started to study a lot, some older psychiatrists. that actually it was a really gray area, that there was no clear dividing line. And so what I thought was a 1 in 20,000 experience like I had was actually more like 1 in 20, but that the experiences were more difficult for other people.
Mm.
But based on my research, because there were pioneering psychiatrists and psychologists in the 70s who saw psychosis as an intended reorganization of the psyche, and that you could support it without medications. And so that became my start. I was like, well, why don't I just try and support her without the medications? And when I was planning to go to the family to tell them about this, her sister, Eliana, the older sister, had returned from Europe, and she went into psychosis as well. Two sisters having acute psychosis 4 months apart for the first time in their lives.
Mm.
So the parents were devastated, but the older sister came to me first and my wife first, and we supported her through the psychosis. And it took a few shots in one summer, but eventually we were able to get her back to university, studying, finished with honors, went on to have a great job, and was medication free for the next 7 years. And so that success, that incredible success of supporting someone that we really cared about through that process and getting her back into society and thriving without psychiatric medications and without the bipolar diagnosis, that was like, okay, this is the future I need to go for.
Mm.
And then I start to learn about trauma. And then a huge part of trauma can be grieving. And in that way, it's not a whole lot different than physical abuse, sexual abuse, in the sense that it's a bioenergetic blockage that needs to be released. And it needs to be released somatically. So talk therapy can help, but at some point, you've got to open up those energies on the somatic level. That would be my take on it, especially if you're really having trouble getting past the situation.
Mm. Mhm. Yeah, and so how do you work with people? Do you just do the breath work, or are there other things that you do to help?
Well, and don't forget, we're talking about bipolar disorder in this case,
Mm.
that I started doing these experimental retreats in 2013, and I was working with a wide variety of techniques, the meditation and nature walks and a few other things. But the breath work was so powerful that we just decided, you know what, the focus of the retreat should be do as much breath work as the client wants to do, and then rest.
Mm.
Because when you're bringing material up from the unconscious, it can be exhausting. And I've worked even in talk therapy sessions for myself. I've had situations where I'll open up emotionally with material that's clearly coming to the surface from the unconscious to the conscious, just from talking about it. And then I go home exhausted and have to have a 2-hour nap. So some of my clients, especially with deeper disorders, they would do like instead of a 3-hour session, 30 minutes of breath work and then sleep the rest of the day. you know
Mm.
so breath work is a really underestimated, misunderstood tool. And if someone out there is grieving and they're really stuck, I would suggest getting in touch with a holotropic breathwork facilitator. There are facilitators out there that think they know what they're doing and they don't.
Mm.
The biggest thing about grieving or releasing trauma is that you need to be able to go into the emotion and fully express it with the presence of somebody else who is not going to try and manipulate your situation. And part of manipulating is, for example, soothing. We all want to say, oh, it's going to be okay. Things are going to get better. Oh, don't cry. It's fine. I'm here for you, and all these kind of things. But what my mother really appreciated from me was my own holotropic breathwork training, which was that you're just present and you allow the person to express the emotions as best they can and protect them. And my mother would say to me while I live with her, she'd say, Sean, I can be here crying and you're just there on your laptop doing your thing. That means a lot to me. And it was just me being in the room without trying to therapize her or, you
Mhm.
know, we often think when somebody's grieving, for example, all of a sudden everybody becomes your therapist. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Oh, you should be doing this, you should be doing that. the holotropic breathwork orientation is to give people the space to express what they need to go through without manipulating the situation and controlling it. And so, even to the extent that if you did go for holotropic breathwork and you spoke about your issue with grieving, that's great. But when you go into the breathwork, the healing agent is what we call the inner healer. Stan Groff calls it the inner healer. And the inner healer is a divine intelligence that knows what needs to heal in that moment better than either one of us do.
Mm-hmm.
So and that's basically, I think it's God. Could be aliens, could be angels, but I'm pretty sure it's God. And this divine intelligence will bring up what needs to come to the surface, you know. So we don't even say, okay, go into your grief. No, we just say, breathe aggressively, express yourself, and what needs to come up will come up in that moment the way you need it. And if you're dealing with a grief issue, chances are grief is going to come up pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, this is fascinating. So you have a book as well.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us about your book.
So, Bipolar Awakenings, The Quest to Heal Bipolar Disorder. It's not so much about grieving a whole lot, but it talks about the development of the work. And I've developed other techniques, for example, online therapy processes. One of the things I've learned, for example, is that um, the inner healer that Groff talked about is actually a healing field, and that when people have had enough personal work themselves, they can do that healing work on behalf of others. And so we call it surrogate breath work, you know. So if you're, for example, if you're feeling really stuck with any particular issue, and you want to work with me, for example, I can go into a breathwork process on this side, and I'll deal with whatever surfaces, you know, with whatever comes up. And then, and this was happening on the retreats, was that after 3 or 4 days on retreat, I would be exhausted by the energies of the client. I'd be having many nightmares related to their experiences. So they were dealing with fear. My nightmares are full of fear, this kind of thing. And I eventually realized that if I did breath work on behalf of the client, then that would be very, very powerful for them too, including other people in the room that were also empathetic, you know. So the typical routine, for example, when I have a retreat with somebody, is that they do their breath work, which I call bipolar breath work. It's formatted a little bit differently because they can stop whenever they want. So we do their breath work in the morning, and then we take a little bit of a break, and then I breathe on their behalf afterwards. And usually I'm working through material that's more painful than they can go through themselves, because I've got more experience and it's not my material too, you know.
Right.
So it becomes just energy. It doesn't have a personal thing, you know. And that can be done at a distance as well. So I talk about how these different innovations came up. And I also teach people how to work on their conscious emotions um, using the same style of breathwork techniques that we use. And I call that conscious emotional clearing. And that can be coached in a Zoom call. So I talk about all the development of that in the book. And so it's
Very
been a
cool.
fun ride.
Yeah, it's so interesting, people's stories and the things that happen to us and what we learn from that, and then what we get to share with others. And certainly in this audience, there's somebody who's going to relate to what you just talked about, and maybe many people. I don't know, but
So,
for sure, it is absolutely, I think, amazing that you are sharing your story and that you're sharing the work that you've done and helping people. So, do you have upcoming retreats that you want to tell people about?
well, I do them one client at a time. So when I
Okay.
have a client call me, then we set it up.
Okay.
And I'm feeling like I just want to share one little story before we go, just to
Okay.
show how things can play out in a non-ordinary state experience, because this was a client I had that was actually in mild psychosis when I was working with them. He was staying in my apartment, and 4 o'clock in the morning, he came into my bedroom. Sean, there's an alien in my stomach. I said, okay. Got out of bed, went out to his bedroom, sat down next to him, and I said, so what's the alien's name? Ask the alien what their name is. He goes, Sylvia. I said, oh, it's Sylvia. Okay. Sylvia was his girlfriend who had committed suicide.
Ah,
And so all of a sudden, we're into this grieving space again, you know?
mm,
And then they had this conversation about, and it seemed like, sometimes you hear about souls that get stuck between reality and the other dimension.
mm.
And yeah, she was like, well, I don't know where else to go. And he was like, well, you don't need to stay with me now. You can go now. And then he waved her. He goes, bye. And was like consciously releasing this spirit.
Hmm.
So I don't know how much of that is just his own inner world that he's working out, or maybe she was still with him in some capacity, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. And it's really hard to know, right? Like, I mean, my partner right now, he's a medium, but his favorite thing to do is to cross souls over. And so he will often, if he's heard of a death of a loved one or someone, he'll check and make sure that
Mm,
they've crossed over. And he loves to help them do that. And so,
mm.
it's we always worry then, right? It's like, do you tell people about that? Or are they gonna think that you're not okay?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. And that's why podcasts are so great,
Yes,
to do
like on the
this.
podcast, we talk about all the things. And it's a safe place to do that. But
Hmm.
we certainly do vet when
Yeah.
we're out in the general public for sure.
I have one more story I have to tell.
Yes.
Because typically I work with people with bipolar, like I said, but I had this one girl contacted me, and I think she did have a bipolar diagnosis or a mild bipolar diagnosis, but her husband had died. He had died of a drug overdose at the age of 40. So I agreed to do what I call the distance surrogate breath work for her, where I breathe for her at a distance
Right.
to have this come up. As I said, not necessarily to help her in her grieving, but just to help her in general. And
Right.
then whatever comes to me, comes to me. So I go into my state down here in Brazil, or I'm working through my thing. And during the sessions, I can have physical sensations that relate to a client, or images that pop up, and dreams that come afterwards. And in her session, nothing came up in particular until the end. I noticed that my hand was like this. And I didn't know what this meant. Because he had a drug issue, I thought it might have been something demonic, like the horns of the devil or something like this.
Mm.
I showed her, I took a picture of my hand and I said, my hand ended up like this. What do you think this could be about? And she told me, she said, my husband gave me a cup with the word love on the side of it in sign language, LOVE, the four letters in sign language. She said, whenever I see that hand gesture you made, it tells me it's about love. I looked up my hand gesture on Google, love in sign language, ASL, and that was it. That I love you is that sign. In
Wow.
yeah, she was so inspired by that, so touched that she actually got a tattoo of her husband as an astronaut with his hand in that position, sticking out, pointing at her like, I love you. So that was an amazing thing for me. I got goosebumps just telling you the story.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was
Well,
very
okay.
nice.
So people have had a taste of, who you are and what you do. How can they find you?
You can't. I work in secret. I don't want to get arrested.
Okay.
No, no, I'm kidding. I am at my website, bipolarawakenings.com. And I use that name because when most people contact me, they'll say, well, do I have a mental illness or do I have a spiritual experience? And I tell them, I say, look, it's a mesh. It's both things. You're going through a very difficult awakening. And if you work on yourself, it could be really beneficial. If you're not working on yourself and you ignore what's going on within you, you could end up medicated for life. So it's got the potential to swing both ways. It's not a mental illness, though, but it does have the potential to be very debilitating if you don't work on it. So that's bipolarawakenings.com is where you can find pretty much everything about me
Okay.
there. Oh, and both books are available as free PDFs
Oh,
on the site.
nice. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, that's great. Well, I encourage people to
Yeah.
check that out. Are they on your website then? The book.
The books are on my website as PDFs, and there's links to Amazon as well, but free PDFs are there. Yeah,
Okay.
right at the top, very easy to find.
All right. Perfect. Well, thanks again for taking the time to do this today. I really appreciate it. And any last final words you want to share before we go?
I think that we're just scratching the surface in terms of how to heal trauma as a society emotionally. I don't think we get it at all. I think
Mhm.
we've done okay intellectually, but there's so much to learn about trauma and emotions and healing and somatic healing and our natural relationship to spirit, regardless of your religion. You know, atheists have a soul too. You know, it's and I think we need to get to a place where that's kind of recognized. And if we do get there, I think we can have real societal transformation.
Yeah, beautiful.
You know,
We're going to hold out hope for that.
yeah. And realize that our deceased loved ones are not that far away. You
Mm,
know, they're right here,
yeah,
right, Dad? Yeah,
absolutely.
you know,
Well,
yeah.
thank you so much again. And
Thank you,
thanks
Angela. It's
everyone.
been a pleasure.
Yeah, mine too. And thank you everyone for listening. And bye for now.